So we're talking about class, we're talking about the transformation of work, we're talking about a debate that's been going on now for about, say, for practical purpose and today's purposes, going back to the late 60s. You can take it back to Daniel Bell and the rise of post-industrial society. And you can trace it through to kind of key contributions from Andre Gortz, through to kind of people like coming out of the Marxism Today tradition, through to people like Manuel Castells, Anthony Giddens, Lord Giddens, Richard Sennett, all these sorts of people. And so I'll kind of offer a couple of observations on that. The first thing to say is that there's this inverse law of evidence operating, in that the larger claims that are made by people, the smaller the evidence they offer for it to substantiate their positions. If you go back to people like Daniel Bell talks about the rise of post-industrial society. He talks about the significance of the rise of service industry, employment, certain occupational shift, and so forth. Now, and he offers very, very good data for it. It's really interesting, and it's a model of its kind. He's also very, very modest in his judgments. He argued against people talking about the knowledge economy of the time, which was coming through. He says, look, let's draw very limited inferences about that. At the same time, there's people like Alvin Toffler who say the changes we're witnessing now at this point in time are greater than anything since the start of the transition from hunter-gatherer society. It's a huge claim for societal transformation. And the evidence he offers is things like the plastic pens, disposable diapers, the growth of rentalism, the sense of anecdotal evidence of change. And all along we have this idea of an inverse balance between the huge claims we're making for transformation and evidence to support it. Now, you can take that all the way through to the contemporary times, because there's more people in this debate who are like Alvin Toffler than they are like Daniel Bell. Evidence is lacking in those huge claims for societal change and some fundamental shift in the nature of work, of employment relations, and so forth. So the first thing to say is that it's got a history, and interestingly, it's got a history that is significantly post-Marxist. In other words, we're talking about people who are describing the world of work and how it changes and so forth, and we're not talking about the Charles Handys of this world, looking at management gurus and fortunes, talking to businessmen about the changing nature of industry and technology and so forth. We're talking to people who are coming from left field. We're talking about the Manuel Castells of this world, Sennett's and so forth. These are the post-Marxists, or people who ended up kind of departing that tradition. But still, if you like, in the word of Peter Marcuse, there's still signs of this ghostly Marxism in how they address the questions of the transformation of working class and so forth. So there's a legacy there. It's coming from left field. It's not coming from the right. The people who are arguing about the end of class, the polarization within class, aren't coming from from the conservative quarters. So it also means that we are shifting in terms of the discourse of sociologists from the structural to the relational. We're not simply talking about transformation of work, which involves changes in occupations, changes in industry and so forth, changes in skill competition and so forth. We're talking about relational shifts in the nature of employment, in the relationship between capital and labour. That's if you like, the order of the what's up for grabs is an enormous transformation in the nature of society, nature of class, a shift, many would suggest, in the balance of class forces, in the composition of class, which is described in terms of, in many ways, of increasing polarization. Now, this shift towards seeing changes in the nature of class and within interclass differences has also been suffused by dual labour market theory. Dual labour market theory, you probably know better under ideas of, with flexible labour markets, we saw the growth of core and periphery groups. A group that is it used to call the primary labour market, where you had people with permanent secure jobs, long-term prospects, And we had a secondary group who were just people who didn't enjoy that. And so it was later called a group that was described as numerically flexible, part-time, casual, temporary, and so forth, against those who were functionally flexible. Polarization taking along those lines. Now, we need to stop for a minute on dual labour market theory and ideas of polarization within the class. There's something perverse about it. Perverse in terms of its method. Because it offers, well, first of all, it's a method that says, I define this group, this periphery, in terms of what it isn't. This is not the non-standard working, this is not the standard working class, it's not the typical working class, it's atypical and non-standard. It's designed in terms of what it isn't. That's like saying, I define people in this room in terms of they're not fascist. It doesn't really get me very far in defining all your politics, except to say what you aren't. Now that's in terms of method, a very poor way of going. Now, there's something else with this as well, in terms of perverse generalization. If you lump together a disparate group of part-time, temporary, casual, and so forth, and you represent their experience based upon the worst elements of that group, then you hugely exaggerate the bad conditions they have within this group. Similarly, with the primary group, the core group, and so forth, if you take from the very, very best and you extend and represent the primary group, they're exaggerating. So one point with this labour market dualism idea is it hugely exaggerates on both sides how good life is for the primaries and how bad life is for the secondaries. And the other thing to say, and do a quick, and I'm sure because you've all come across the idea of core and periphery in your own minds, have a small exercise in your head. Imagine the workforce. Put in one group all those who work full time. Put also and add to them all those who are permanent. Who is left? What proportion of working class is there? My guess is about 3 or 4%. If you put in one group the permanent and the full time, that's one group, and the rest are left out. The reason why you have such a large number in primary and in the full-time and the permanent is that the status of this periphery is hugely expanded by inclusion of part-time permanent workers. Now, how you understand that is enormously important. And if you generalize from a casualization at the fringes to a whole swathe of the working class, going through occupying up to 40%, then you're hugely overstating the problems that you have. Now, the evidence does not support the arguments for structural change in the working class leading to impermanent employment, labour market disaffiliation, detachment, and so forth. It just isn't there. Any number of statistics will tell you this, and I'll offer you one that you haven't heard yet, because it's not had a public airing until this afternoon. And that is, well, first of all, job stability hasn't declined. Long-term employment has increased across high turnover industries and low turnover industries, on private sector and public sector. That has happened in terms of the OECD countries, in terms of Australia, Canada, and so forth. That is the trend. Long-term employment has only declined in Europe in agriculture. Temporary employment agencies, which are an enormous part of the argument about this impermanent workforce, account for 1% of the workforce in Europe and North America. 1%. And yet we have this huge intellectual edifice built around them. Now, part-time employment has massively expanded job stability and long-term employment, especially for women. Part-time employment has added to labour market retention and affiliation and attachment of women to the labour market. So flexible labour market, in its most significant statistical sense, has added to job stability. And finally, because I anticipate Guy's argument coming up, because I've had a spat, a friendly spat, elsewhere, when he kind of had the temerity to say my data was out of date. America, where employment protection is relatively weak, where unions are relatively weak compared to Europe. Between 1983 and 2010, and here we have it, you heard it first on Radio ISJ, average job tenure has increased by 25%. 25% increase in average job tenure over that period, almost 3 decades. The argument for the growth of this transient, impermanent, casualized workforce isn't there to substantiate the point. Now, therefore, what is job insecurity? Now, it is a complex thing, and what I'm saying in the first instance, it's not explained by the rate of redundancy, the prospect for redundancy, or, in fact, the growth of part-time employment, and all these signs of new employment patterns. There's a fantastic study done by some researchers in Cambridge, because according to opinion poll evidence, 30% of the workforce describe a high, insecurity. There's a reasonable chance, they think, or express, that within a year their jobs might be gone. The study did a very good follow-up with these workers who said, my job might not be here in a year's time. And they probed them, and they said, do you really think your job's not going to be here in a year's time? And the argument was, well, no. But we're worried about the consequence of that job going. So they were not talking about the likelihood of job loss, but the consequence of that. And the reasons for insecurity was more to do with the environment in which they worked, market conditions under which they worked, not to do with the content of their jobs, whether exposed to ICT or what have you. Yep. Job insecurity is also critically expressed, or the rise in insecurity is critically expressed by those who already are relatively secure. Because if you are already insecure, if you already have low insurance employment prospects, you're not going to miss what you never had. So imagine, say, for instance, actors. Actors, by and large, some people might say, well, they are obviously secure because they don't adjust in life. But they know that. Actors know that unless they're kind of Ken Barlow from Coronation Street, they're not going to be working in a soap for 40 years. They're going to be on very, very short-term engagements. That's what they expect. However, what happens is those who previously had a high expectation of employment prospects, and when that is dashed, you see the rise in job insecurity, and that's why it happened very significantly in the 1990s. And ironically, it arose, this is a point made by Francis Green, it arose during periods of employment declines. It happened during the 1990s. So it's a complex thing, but certainly what it's not tied to is the sense that jobs are less substantial, they're less needed by employers. Otherwise, we couldn't explain the very significant shift in terms of long-term retention of labour. Now, I've got a couple of slides in terms of, because our concept is class today. It's about the... There we go. What does it all mean? I mean, one of the structural changes in the working class has to do with the impact of crises. Don't leave, Guy. It's to do with the impact of crises. And first of all, with the recession of 1979 to 84, it is hugely significant in terms of its impact upon manufacturing, and very, very importantly, large-scale manufacturing. So the total loss of jobs in manufacturing in this recession was 1.86 million. In establishing, employing 1,000 to 1,500, 300, almost just over a third of a million were gone. In establishments, big factories in manufacturing, employing more than 1,500 people, almost a million. Just over half of all job losses in manufacturing went in those, in those large firms, large factories. That was the experience, and many of you will remember the period that we're talking about, when there were broadcasts every evening about 5,000 jobs in the northeast, about 1,000 gone in South Wales, night after night after night. And what we see here is the impact of the crisis hugely concentrated in terms of sector and also geography, in terms of the northeast, South Wales, northwest, and so forth. 1990s recession is different. The impact is much less concentrated. Other sectors share in the job loss. The number of job losses in the service sector in the 1990s recession was double that in the previous recession. So it's moving across sectors and across industry. Job insecurity, and this is my point, grows in parts of the workforce that previously expected high levels of and good employment prospects. So they have had high prospects and they will begin to exposed to it. Now, we're talking here about the current recession, and first of all, to reinforce the point made earlier on, that the current recession in terms of growth, GDP decline, is comparable with the 1930s. It's lower than the recession of 1981 and 1991. It's significantly lower. So we're talking about 30s level of recession in terms of growth. What's really interesting and what we need to address and recognize, in terms of unemployment, it's very, very different. In other words, if you look at here, this recession, in terms of unemployment, is much lower than the previous two recessions. So we're talking about a crisis of capitalism that's resulted in 8% unemployment, and it's maintained that significantly for quite a few quarters, as economists say. My point is this, that the impact of recession, how it is felt and experienced by the working class, is not confined to jobs. And it also happens in terms of wages, benefits, pensions, and so forth, much, much broader in terms of its impact. So if we look at the impact of this structural change within the last 30 years, when it was very, very concentrated and condensed geographically and sectorally, it is now generalizing across the working class, across the public sector, not just in jobs. The impact of that is to generalize, it is to establish the commonality of interests across occupations, across regions, across sectors. It generalizes massively. It reinforces the need to collectively resist, to defend that common interest. And the argument that somehow technological change or what have you has driven some kind of polarization within the class is not only wrong, it's going the opposite direction. Thanks.
I want to start my contribution to this discussion by going back to the question of what do we mean by class, because it's clear from all of the discussion that we've had today that class is something that absolutely shapes our lives, our prospects, our future, how long we live, how we die. All of these things are shaped by class, and yet it's one of the areas that I think is discussed in academia, in the media, in popular discussion, in one of the most superficial terms. So I think it's worth us going back to think, what is it that we actually mean? And I want to argue that Marxism and classical Marxism still offers today the best way for us to understand what class means, and also how we can start to unlock some of the problems that we've been discussing this morning, where we can find the agency to start to unlock some of the problems of how we overthrow capitalism and how we start to solve some of those contradictions. You see, for Marxists, class is a relationship, a social relationship, based on exploitation. And the great Marxist historian G.M. de Stéquois put it the following way. He said, class, essentially a relationship, is the collective social expression of the fact of exploitation, the way in which exploitation is embodied in a social structure. So for Marxists, class is not subjective. It's not about how you feel. It's not about how you speak. It's not about any of this. It might explain some of these things. It might, but it's not based on these things. It's not about where you live in the country. It's not about your lifestyle. And it's not an individual trait. It's not something that you own on your own. It is a collective and social relationship to the way in which the economy is structured. And therefore it's a collective relationship, and it's about our relationship to economic production. And because it's based on exploitation, because it's based on the extraction of surplus value from the workers by the capitalists, it's an antagonistic relationship. It's a relationship which has conflict built into it from the very beginning. So forget whatever you may have been told about class as a series of stratifications, it's based on status or lifestyle, all the rest of it. We're talking about a social relationship based on exploitation. And on this basis, Marx saw capitalism as it was beginning to develop in his time, and as it has developed from his time to ours, if you like, as spreading everywhere that capitalism spread, spreading the predominance of the two major classes, the ruling class or the bourgeoisie, who own and control collectively the means of production, the means of making wealth in society, and the working class, the proletariat, the majority class in society today, who neither own nor control the means of production and who are forced to sell our ability to work for the capitalists in order to survive. And I'm sorry if I'm telling people things that they already know about the basis of Marxism, but it's worth people remembering that this is contested territory. And actually, apart from a small number of people in the classical Marxist tradition, the majority of people commentating on class today do not accept this. And it's an important category because we're going to come on to talk about how the working class has changed and how it's restructured and what it's changed. And what I want to explain is that the fundamentals that I've just laid out about how people survive by going to work, by creating profit for somebody else, is what shapes the fact that we're part of the working class. Not whether they're temporary workers, not whether they're permanent workers, not whether they work full-time or whether they work part-time, not whether they work down a mine or whether they work in a university. But this fundamental relationship to the economy is what defines our basis of what makes class. Now this, of course, gives us a general framework. That in itself is not a substitute for trying to understand what is happening, how class is changing, reshaping and measuring what the balance of forces are objectively and subjectively between our side and the ruling class. So I want to move on, and what I want to deal with really in the remainder of the time that I have is I want to pick up on three arguments that are three of the key arguments I think historically are thrown out to try and knock down a Marxist interpretation of what class means and how it applies to the world today. The first one, I think, is the argument that the working class has shrunk or has changed beyond recognition and is no longer relevant. The second one is that workers have been rendered powerless by structural changes. In particular, at the moment, we're told that globalization and neoliberalism have so far transferred the balance of power from workers to capital that workers no longer have any power, and our analysis is therefore irrelevant. And thirdly, I want to deal with some of the things that were mentioned by Kevin. Actually, Kevin's covered all of these areas to some degree, and I'm going to hopefully develop some of the things along my own lines of analysis. But the third thing I want to take up is the question of whether there are sections of the better working class that have been bought off by either material or immaterial privileges. And none of these arguments are new. As Kevin before me has spelt out, you can trace them right back to the 60s. They recur and they reoccur in different times, and as class struggle goes up and down, you notice a little pattern that when struggle goes down, everybody says it's all over, and then struggle comes back up and makes them look very foolish, and this happens a whole series of times in history. But they're important arguments, firstly because they now form, I think, much of the common sense of the left, not just of left academics, but of large sections of the trade union bureaucracy who put very pessimistic arguments about the power of workers in a globalised economy. And also they're very important because for us they deal with the question of agency, don't they? How you understand the composition and the power and the potential power of the working class leads you to the question of who is the agency that is able to challenge capitalism. So firstly, has the working class shrunk? I'm going to primarily look at the questions as they apply to the developed OECD nations. Now, there is a whole other discussion to be had about what is occurring in the global south, and maybe this is something we can pick up on in the discussion. Certainly nobody would argue that the working class is shrinking. Well, I hope nobody would argue the working class is shrinking in the global south, as we've seen the spread of capitalist relations across the global south and the increase of manufacturing in many countries there. In Britain and the rest of the developed nations, the argument that the working class has shrunk is based on a very narrow definition of what working class is. It is based on those stereotypes of working class people are people who work in factories, in mines, and a moment of the history of working class has been taken as a truism to explain what it is to be working class. Now, it is true that manufacturing has declined. This isn't going to come as a shock to anybody that we're going to accept this fact here today. There are smaller numbers of people today in Britain by quite a significant amount working in manufacturing than there were, say, in the 60s or in the 70s. That is true, that decline. We shouldn't overstate that decline. Manufacturing is still a significant part of the British economy, but it has declined. Interestingly, one of the reasons that numbers involved in manufacturing has declined is related to some of the things that came out in the previous section about the increased productivity of workers as capitalism ages and modernises, so that actually, to maintain levels of production, less workers are required because of the changes in production techniques. So although production has declined, manufacturing production has declined in Britain, it's still the case that manufacturing output in Britain actually reached its peak in 2007. And what you find is that actually, because of some of these transformations that have taken place, because less workers can still maintain or even increase the level of production because of new production techniques, in some ways those workers actually become more powerful than previous workers, because a smaller number of workers can have a bigger impact on a larger amount of the economy through the action that they take. A couple of other things about the working class and the role of manufacturing, because you see, the argument goes that manufacturing has gone, the old working class has gone, and it's been replaced by the service sector. People say this in terribly derogatory ways, of which service sector apparently isn't real work, which, I can tell you, working 12-hour shifts 3-4 times a week, it certainly feels like real work. But as the speaker in the last session said, the idea of a service sector is a pretty incoherent way to understand the world of work. And as he explained in the last session, it covers everything, doesn't it? It covers people who work in the welfare state, who are absolutely part of a modern capitalist economy and are absolutely part of the reproduction of the labour force. I don't mean having babies, I mean reproduction in terms of training, education, healthcare that is required to produce a skilled workforce that the capitalists need. But it also covers lots of things that are thought of as old manual traditional working class jobs: transport, the postal service, porters in hospitals. It covers people who work in hotels and catering. It covers all sorts of different... It's not a very useful category of analysis. The other section that people talk about in terms of the way in which the working class is restructured is a shift towards white-collar workers, which is absolutely true, that there has been a huge growth in white-collar workers over the past decades, both in the private and in the public sector, and even manufacturing actually increasingly needs white-collar workers in order to do their job and in order to maintain production and productivity. And it used to be that white-collar workers were a minority in the workforce. And that's not the case, I don't think, anymore in places like Britain. And I think one of the transformations that you see over the past couple of decades that's very interesting if you think about where we stand politically today is the way in which sections such as the public sector have very much moved to the core of the working class and of organised workers in Britain today. And we can come back to this in a little while. And partly that's to do with some of the things that Kevin has talked about in terms of the way in which the attacks have moved from the private sector to the public sector, and part of it is to do, I think, also with the importance of the public sector and the way in which public sector work has changed in terms of the way management have tried to smash terms and conditions and introduced more privatisation into the public sector and a whole number of other attacks on the way in which we work in the public sector. At the same time, as we've seen a decline in manufacturing and this shift to white-collar workers, it's also true that we've seen other areas of industry growing. It is the case in Britain today that supermarkets are now the second largest industry. People will be well aware that call centres are now a growing industry, something that people call the satanic mills of the 21st century in terms of the way in which they crowd people into quite horrible conditions. But it's not true today that workers are dissipated, are atomised. People talk about the loss of the car plants, the loss of the mines, and all of those things, which are absolutely true. Many large workplaces and the communities that surrounded them have been decimated. But in Britain today, the majority of people still work in workplaces of more than 50 employees. And there are a whole number of workplaces now where the numbers are much, much greater. You think of sections of the public sector in universities, in hospitals, or you think about You know, the Heathrow Airport is one of the biggest employers in London. There are workplaces that bring together huge amounts of people. It's not true that the working class is atomised and split into tiny little places. Now, along with the idea that we've seen the decline in manufacturing, I think adds to the common sense of this idea that we've heard about, that Kevin has touched on himself, about the idea of insecurity and the rise in precarious work, something obviously that I'm assuming that Guy is going to go on to talk about, as he's written the key text on this question in his book, the key modern text on this question in the Precariat. And I agree very much with the thrust of what Kevin has said before me about how many of the structural changes in work are exaggerated, and that we shouldn't exaggerate the way in which work has transformed for most people. It is still the case, even with all the things that we know are true about the use of agency work, the rising unemployment, all the rest of it, it's still true that the majority of people who are in work are in permanent work. It's also true the majority of people are in permanent full-time work, although I agree as well that part-time work is not necessarily insecure work and has added actually to some of the security and the growth of permanent jobs in the economy. So we shouldn't exaggerate the trend to which precarious working has become the norm, and we shouldn't just accept this as being the case. Now, and it's also true that as work has restructuralised and new industries have grown, we should neither accept that these places are precarious workplaces. And just because somewhere is ununionised or has less unionised traditions, such as in supermarkets or call centres, does not in itself make these precarious workplaces or make these places in which insecure work is the norm. In fact, I was looking at a study a few weeks ago which looked at call centres in Britain and found that the majority of people working in call centres in Britain have been working there for over 3 years, some of them longer, obviously some of them a bit less long. Now, none of this, I think, means that we should be complacent. It is true that we face real challenges at work, and anybody who works somewhere where there is a mixture of permanent contracts and temporary contracts, or where agency workers, even in a very small number, have been introduced into their workforce, will know that this throws up real challenges about how you organise, and will know also, reflecting some of what Kevin said earlier, how that this is used to increase the threat of insecurity in your job, and whether that insecurity is real or imagined, it has real effects on how people feel about their workplace, that people feel the threat of unemployment, of privatisation, of their replacement by casuals, their replacement by agency workers. And so I think we have to say the fear outstrips the reality, but that doesn't mean that we don't have any real issues to grapple with in terms of how we organise people in ununionised work, how we organise people who are in agency work, and how we bring those people into the core of the organised workforce. Now, we face challenges is true, but none of this is to say that I accept the premise, which hopefully Guy will go on to explain and that people can read about in his book, the premise that the precariat in some way represents a new class of workers. As far as I can see, the precariat represents a section of the working class. Often people will move in and out. At some point in your life you may have a full-time temporary or a permanent job, at some time you may have a temporary job. It's not true that these things are separate. And it's also not true that any of these battles that we face today are new. None of them create a justification for saying that we have a new class of workers. Take casualisation, for example. Casualisation has actually been the norm for a lot of employment under capitalism over the last, since its inception actually. And you take somewhere like the docks, where over the last 100 years there's been struggles that have gone forwards and backwards over the question of whether or not people have casualised contracts or full-time contracts. It's something that goes forwards and something that goes backwards. Those battles are not new, and neither is the restructuring of the working class. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that's thrown at Marxists often is that we're the people who say that nothing ever changes. That's not the Marxist position. The Marxist position is that everything always changes. And our understanding of the working class is that it's constantly restructuring. Because I talked about exploitation at the beginning as being one of the key defining features, one of the key defining divides of capitalism. The other key defining divide of capitalism is the divide of competition. And that competition leads to the constant restructuring of capital and the search for new industries, new ways to make money. And that means that the working class is always restructured. In the 1830s and 40s, the biggest concentration of the working class in places like Britain was in textiles, with mill workers. That was then replaced 40 years later by the growth in mines and heavy industry, things like shipbuilding. By the Second World War, that had changed again, so you have an expansion in the car industry, electrical goods, light manufacturing. And the interesting thing is that every shift and restructuring has been accompanied by the sorts of arguments that I talked about at the beginning. The idea that the working class is no longer relevant, the idea that there is either a new privileged class or a new underclass that is no longer part of the working class and no longer organisable in the same way. And every time people have regretted with some form of nostalgia what the old working class used to be. I was even reading something from the 1870s where a former Chartist was lamenting the fact that the working class wasn't what it used to be. It's no longer wearing the rags and arguing earnestly about social issues, but now wandering around well-dressed and wandering around with greyhounds covered in cloth and a length of string. So, that was their complaint then. Today, people complain that there aren't enough workers wandering around with greyhounds on a piece of string. So you can't have it both ways, can you? But as Kevin pointed out, there's a whole body of work that has tried to theorise the disappearance of the working class, and I think we have to locate the ideas that there is a new class called the precariat into this realm of work. Now I'm just going to move on very quickly. Second argument, which I'm going to do much more briefly, has neoliberalism and globalisation, have they rendered workers powerless? Now, there's a whole body of work arguing this as well, and we don't have well, I don't have time for a full debate on neoliberalism. If that's what you choose to do with your time, then that's absolutely fine. And I think we just have to remember that there are a whole number of myths about neoliberalism and globalisation, and we've touched on many of them today, so I won't go into them in detail. But it is true that the perceived threat that globalisation offers us way outstrips the reality, that capital is not footloose and fancy-free, that most corporations are heavily intertwined with the domestic states of the areas in which they live, because capital needs the state needs the capital, as we talked about in the previous session. And the threat of relocation of factories, we're going to move abroad if you don't accept a pay cut, a job cut, a change in your working conditions, often largely outweighs the possibilities of them actually doing that. There are some things that it's easy to relocate internationally, and finance being one of those. There are other things that can't be relocated because they're service sector things that relate to people here. You can't, relocate the whole of the postal service for London to Bangkok or something, because how would you get it through the letterboxes? It would be difficult. There are a whole number of other things that can't be relocated abroad. And also it's true that corporations rely not just on being able to find cheap labour, but being able to find stable labour, educated labour, a state that's willing to provide infrastructure for them to do that. And it quite often means that although they try and use competition between different countries or even different towns within the same country, when you look at what some of the corporations do to try and discipline their workforce, the threat is greater than the reality. And capital is not all-powerful. It has met resistance everywhere that it's been, and you only think about the last few decades, from Latin America to the Arab Spring, where the Arab Spring was not a protest just about a dictatorship and about democracy. It was also a protest and revolution over the impact of neoliberalism, over the question of food prices, over a whole number of economic issues. It was a protest against capital as well as against dictatorship. Or you think about the anti-austerity protests, the strikes, the general strikes, November the 30th in Britain. There are a whole number of other things that we can do here. And everywhere that capital has relocated, it's found that it's taken resistance with it. And this is one of the things that they found in the car industry, that everywhere the car industry has gone, that it's thought, we'll go to South Korea because, car workers have been a bit militant in Britain, let's go to South Korea, it'll be quiet there. South Korea, you may have noticed, has an amazing history of militancy in the car plants. It's like militancy in Britain in the 70s, but with much longer batons and flags and sticks and things. So everywhere they go, they find there is resistance. My final point in this argument is about the third point, about is there a privileged section of workers? Because I think one of the most pernicious arguments about saying that there is a new precariat, a new class of people on the fringes of society who are more insecure than everybody else, is that they're pitched in opposition to the core of the working class, the people who supposedly have permanent jobs, good conditions, pensions, a job for life and all the rest of it. Now, much of what that depends on is a lie anyway. And you know, it's not just Guy and people who argue the Precariat who say this. I don't know if people saw Zizek's latest article in the London Review of Books, where Zizek argues that the anti-capitalist protests, strikes and student protests that we've seen in recent years are all best understood as the revolt of what he calls the salaried bourgeoisie. In other words, they're the attempts by people who are privileged in the workforce to protect themselves against descending into becoming proletarian. And he writes, "Who dares strike today when having a permanent job is itself a privilege? Not low-paid workers, but privileged workers who have guaranteed jobs." And the examples that he gives are teachers, public transport workers, and police. Now, let's leave aside the whole question of are the police part of the working class, because we're going to go down and open a whole other can of worms there. But the idea that teachers and public transport workers are part of a privileged elite in the working class is a joke, isn't it? In actual fact, if you look at the number of people who earn less than £7 an hour in Britain, more than 20% of those people work in the public sector. It's an absolute myth that the public sector is this bloated, privileged section, and it echoes the worst arguments of the Tories about our gold-plated pensions, about our privileged position and all the rest of it. It's absolutely not true. And I've been told to hurry, so I'm going to hurry. I'm going to talk faster and faster, you'll see, until I get to the end of my notes. My final point, really, then, is that all of these things that I've talked about matter, and they matter because of the question that I mentioned at the beginning, the question of agency, the question of does power still lie with working class people to challenge the logic of capital and to destroy the logic of capital once and for all. And it means we have to understand two things. Firstly, we have to understand the objective reality of class, that class today, globally as well as locally, the working class constitutes the vast majority of people and objectively has an interest in ending the way in which capitalism perpetuates our exploitation and survives off absolutely survives off our exploitation. The second thing we have to consider is the subjective question of whether our class feels an awareness of that power. And this is what Marx talked about when he talked about how we go from being a class, the working class goes from being a class in itself to a class for itself. So objectively, the restructuring of the working class is nothing like as frightening as it might seem, but all those subjective questions about how people feel, how they feel insecure, how they overcome that feeling of insecurity, about how they understand their position, are absolutely key questions. And that's why the question of struggle comes back all the time. And often when you're a Marxist, people ask, why do you go on about strikes all the time? And, you know, I wasn't on strike this week, but other health workers were, and I took a card round to collect for them. And people often say to me, why are you so interested in strikes all the time? Because strikes are one of the ways in which people learn about their own power and their own ability to resist. It's something that breaks down the divisions. And I think we face many challenges, and one of the main challenges that we face is to continue the battle over public sector pensions in Britain and to try and widen that battle. And I think one of the brilliant things about November the 30th last year was that it was broad enough and wide enough that it did pull in other sections of the workforce. Certainly in the NHS where I work, it did pull in people who are on temporary contracts, people who are on agency work, people who've been outsourced, who joined picket lines because they felt the confidence of being part of a bigger, stronger majority of people. And that means for me that struggle will erupt in all sorts of different ways, from all the things we've talked about the intransigent problems that the ruling class face and the squeezing of our living standards. We know that there will be eruptions and there will be explosions. Some of these will take the form of obvious class struggle, and some of them will be the cry, if you like, of the dispossessed, the riots, the protests and all the rest of it. But for revolutionary Marxists, the strategic question is still, where does the power lie? To link all those explosions to a strategic question of where does power lie to bring capitalism to an end, and that lies with the organised working class.
Thank you very much. It seems I'm at a triple disadvantage. First, it's the graveyard shift. I'm the last speaker in what's been an exhausting day. Second, I've just worked it out that I've got -5 minutes to respond. And third, there are 2 against 1. But let me. Sorry. Thank you very much. Now, let me begin by saying I didn't want to focus on the stylized facts particularly, not because I'm afraid of them. I'm, on the contrary, I think that the developments of the global labor process is pointing very much to a fundamental set of changes that have been taking place. And I find it slightly odd for the critics to be saying that there's not been any real change, that the employment duration is going up, and that stability in the labour market is going up, and that national capitalism is staying national, they're not becoming more multinational. And you feel that we've had 30 years of the neoliberal agenda. Well, they must have been a fucking useless lot. That's all I've got to say, because they will have failed to have changed the nature of the labour process. And I find that very hard to take as a stylized interpretation. Now, one of the things that Kevin makes in his book, and it's one fact I'm going to mention because it comes back in my story a little later, is that capital has stayed national. And I think Esme actually had alluded to supporting that thing. So I looked up the latest UNCTAD statistics that between 1990 and 2010, globally, multinational capital, its assets abroad rose by 12-fold, its exports from its subsidiaries abroad quadrupled, and its employment share in foreign affiliates quadrupled. Okay? Now, if you look at what's happened, for example, in a few key countries like the United States, 20 years ago, 1 in 5 employees of an American firm was employed abroad. Today, it's over 1 in 3. So there's been a huge shift in the composition, national to foreign. I was looking at the French statistics. Since the crisis, so-called crisis, hit, employment in France of the major corporations has gone down by 4%. But their global employment of the major corporations of France has gone up by 5%. They've been shifting, but they've actually been expanding in employment. That's only one type of statistic, and I hope the later comments, the relevance of them will come back. Because I come to this issue as a Marxist and as someone who's worked in the International Labour Organization and looking at the international labour process over the past 30 years. And what we did is we built the largest database on trends of these issues that have ever been constructed. For over 150 countries, looking at changes of policies, looking at changing institutions, and looking at changes of outcomes. Now, if anybody is interested, a big publication came out called Economic Security for a Better World, and that database is vast. It has millions and millions of numbers. So when I hear that there aren't any data, you can imagine I feel rather hurt because all that time has been wasted, right? Now, I come to this also as someone steeped in Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. I don't subscribe to the full nature of his teleological paradigm and so on, but I think the mechanisms in his analysis are very instructive in looking at what has been happening. Because I see the crisis, if we want to use that overused term, as in a sense the middle point, something like this, being a little bit crude in the way I'm doing it for brevity, in the process of a global transformation. He analyzed the Great Transformation as the construction of national markets. And we're in the process of a global transformation in the middle of constructing a global market system, for better or worse. And in that process, the globalization era between roughly 1980 and 2008 can be seen as the period of disembeddedness. And now, during that period, financial capital was hegemonic, blah, 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 and all the insecurities and inequalities that he analysed in terms of the Great Transformation have been growing in that period, and we're now at a real crisis point. Now, the analysis which I developed at length in the previous book essentially says that the period between 1919 and approximately 1975 was an era of labour decommodification, in the sense particularly that there was a shift in the structure of social income as the norm away from money wages to, in the case of the United States in particular, and Chinese system, towards enterprise benefits, and in Soviet system and welfare state capitalism towards state benefits. So that Lenin and the welfare state saw a withering of the money wage. And during that process, the social compact basically was that the ruling establishments provided an extensive array of labour security in return for the workers accepting the right to manage and the right to make profits. That was very crudely, roughly how it was. Now that broke down in the 1970s, but I think it's a very key part of that process that there was what Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson and everybody would analyse as a process of proletarianisation that was systematic. And the process of proletarianisation is not just the two freedoms of Marx, but disciplining people to a life of stable, exploited labour. That's slightly oversimplifying, but essentially that, disciplining the norm of people to accept stable labour. Now, the period since neoliberalism came to ascendancy in the 1970s and the 1980s can be seen as an era of labour recommodification. And the recommodification has been involving a number of things which ultimately affect the class fragmentation that I've been trying to analyse, for better or worse, in the series of books. And the shift essentially was, and has been everywhere around the world, a shift back to money wages. And this has made it actually very difficult to interpret income distribution and the distribution of security and various things, because certain groups have been losing enterprise benefits to a great, great extent, and certain groups have been losing access to state benefits. And in return, there was a sort of concession bargaining phase where their money wages were raised. So if you just rely on what has happened to the pattern of money wages, and we know that inequality has grown even there, you understate the extent to which inequality has grown. And what I think has been happening is that with the development of global capitalism, there is a process of precariatization. Now, of course, there have always been precarious workers. I don't find that point very clever. Of course there has. But this era is habituating more and more people to accepting a life of existential insecurity and habituating them to accept unstable labour. A life of unstable labour in which they're constantly expected to update their skills or face obsolescence, to update their charms, or whatever you want to call these bag of tricks that people are expected to learn. So the human resource consultants tell us that every person, all of us, has to spend 15% of our time every year learning new skills. I mean, just think of what the sort of life that's held out at. Now, my analysis has led me not turn that away, not willingly, to thinking in terms of a class fragmentation process that's been taking place globally. I didn't, because of my Marxist background, I didn't go to it willingly. I argued with people like Eric Wright and Thurborn and others who have gone similar sort of way, and Cohen, for example, in his wonderful book. But I've been drawn to think that there's a global class structure that's emerging, and that if we don't take account of that, then our analytical capacities to analyze the tensions and the nature of the class struggle that we have to foster will be missed. And I think if you go into a dualism, of any sort of dualism, then you lose the capacity to analyze the tension. Now, I put at the top an elite of global citizens, these billionaires who are all criminals or verging on being caught as criminals at the top. Chomsky wrote to me and said he thinks a plutocracy is a better word for it. I bow to the great man. I'm quite happy to say that plutocracy is a better word. But you know the types. A long way below them is an emerging group, a salariat, that is shrinking slightly, and certainly since the austerity measures, you'll see a lot more in the public sectors being tipped out of this salariat. These are people with long-term employment security that Kevin talks about, and we know that there is still a large number of those. I don't find any of this nonsense about saying there's a disappearance of employment security. I certainly have never said that, and I don't believe it's true. But it's a shrinking part, and an increasing proportion of the income of the salariat comes from non-wages. It comes from enterprise benefits, all those pensions, all those health insurance, paid holidays, you know, all the sorts of benefits that are given to them. And most crucially, a rising percentage of their income comes from capital. 1/3 of the average American's income today in salaried employment comes from stocks and shares. 1/3, and it's growing. In Germany, the numbers receiving a large part of their income from the stock market has been doubling in the last 10 years. So you've got this phenomenon where you have, you know, where is my interest? And below that, I've got 5 minutes, help. Below that you have the shrinking core. And I don't want to be apologetic about that. The old notion of the proletariat has been shrinking globally. It's been shrinking in India as well as in the rich industrialized countries. But it's, again, as Esme says, it's not disappeared. It's still an important part of our social fabric and the class struggle. It's below them that you have this growing precariat. Now, the precariat should be distinguished from the lumpen precariat. The lumpen are the people who are the social victims. They're outside the capitalist labour market. They're on drugs. They're social victims, etc. And I think it's very important not to equate this emerging precariat with a lumpen underclass, and that a number of people have done. It's not a proletariat either, because it's this being habituated to not only having employment insecurity, but job insecurity. Kevin keeps mixing the two up with respect. But I've got to like him over our arguments, as you can imagine. But job security is not the same as employment security. Employment security means you have a contract, you have the capacity to get costs from your employer if you lose your employment, and you have certain range of rights. Job insecurity is when you don't have control over the type of work you do in your job. The biggest example I give is France Telecom, where they found that a whole lot of the employees committed suicide, and it turned out that they couldn't understand why. They had very strong employment security. But it turned out that the management was shifting them between offices and between functions and so on, and this created incredible insecurity and stress and led to a spate of suicides. Now, because of the occupational re-regulation that I'm not going to have time to talk about that has taken place in this era, it's not deregulation, it's a shift to state control of occupational life that has taken place around the world, that there has been a splintering of occupations, and people in the precariat have less and less control over the nature of their work. The term I use is that a growing number of people are denizens. Denizens, not citizens. And many of the people who become denizens have rights taken away from them. They're not just the migrants. And that increasingly the denizens are a larger and larger part of the precariat. Now, I want to use the last 2 minutes or so that I'm allowed to have, and I apologize for rushing some of this, by saying that I think the essence of the explanation for the growth of the precariat was a Faustian bargain that the ruling establishments made in the 1980s. At that time, they liberalized the world economy, they liberalized capital markets, they liberalized labor markets, and in the process, they trebled the world's labor supply. They trebled by adding several billion extra workers, all prepared or habituated to working for wages and benefits 1/50th of what any Western European would expect. Now, I'm an economist, and any economist should be able to tell you that if you liberalize the system and they're earning very low wages and benefits down here, you're either going to get a great sucking sound of jobs or a crashing of wages and benefits. Governments couldn't afford to do that, and therefore they introduced labor subsidies, which are subsidies to capital, tax credits, cheap consumer credit, and the Faustian bargain took off. And the irony which has not been mentioned in the today, and I feel it's one of these big elephants in the room, is that in the process of globalization, the economy that became the most capitalistic in the world was China. The share of national income in China going to labor fell by 20 percentage points. That is, I think, unprecedented anywhere in the world. And irony number two is that in India, the drop in the share of total national income going to labor was actually greater. But it started from a lower level. Now, in the process, the Faustian bargain allowed governments to go for this labor market flexibility strategy, increasing the insecurities and so on. And ultimately, the Faustian bargain blew up in our faces. And now, of course, we've got this austerity regime, which is a complete nonsense. They did not need to make that Faustian bargain, but they did. Now, I've been told to sum up, and I just want to conclude, because I feel I can't do it, by saying that the final 2 chapters of the book paint what I call the first chapter a politics of inferno. A politics that will happen, and I thought Alex's presentation this morning was very consistent with these 2 possibilities. The politics of inferno, as if more and more people in part of the precariat and fearing they're falling into the precariat will be led in the direction of populism and a neo-fascism that is very threatening. While the state becomes more utilitarian, more looking after that famous squeezed middle, and more authoritarian with panopticon techniques and so on. Now, I paint that picture graphically. The Financial Times said that I'm predicting it. I said, no, I didn't predict it. I said it's a possibility. But I'm an optimist. And I think the real challenge for us on the left is to have a politics of paradise, which has a vision of an egalitarian society. And the trouble we've had over the last 30 years, I don't want to generalize because I'm sure there are big exceptions in the room, is that we've failed to have a radical egalitarian vision of what sort of good society we would like to put in its place. And that radical vision, and with your apologies to the chair, I'm just going to sum this up. I think we've forgotten 3 great principles of progressives through the ages. And I'm going to put it a little sharply because brevity for the chair and your patience. But the first principle is that every forward march is defined by the needs and insecurities of the emerging mass group in society. If you want to use the word class, that's fine. If you hate the word class unless it's used in the 2-class system, I don't mind. The second principle is every forward march is defined by new forms of collective action. It's always been the case historically. At the moment, we've been seeing the primitive rebels stage. Last year was primitive rebels stage. People know what they're against. A lot of anti-this, anti-that, anti-this, but not yet clear what we're for. And that is a primitive rebel stage. And the third principle is that every forward march is about three overlapping struggles. It's all very well for us to talk about struggles and all that stuff. What is it we're struggling for? And the struggle, I think, first of all, is for recognition. Now, since I've written this book, I've been invited all over the place. And more people are quite proud to say, I belong to the precariat. I belong to the precariat, and I'm not ashamed. All right? And that recognition, that is very important, because that, I think, came in a big way last year. It came in the Occupy movements, it came in Indignados, it came in Syntagma Square, and in various other places. The second thing is a struggle for representation. Why the unions are opposed by large groups in the precariat is that they do not have a voice, agency in the unions, they do not have agency in the organs of the state, and they do not have due process mechanisms for themselves to struggle. That sense of representation. And the third and final form of struggle is a struggle for redistribution. And the struggle for redistribution need not be the same thing as it was a century ago. And that's the final part of the book. And I genuinely believe that that is an egalitarian agenda. It's a radical transformative agenda. And it ultimately says that we should not regard the precariat merely as victims. Many in the precariat openly reject the old labourist solutions. And I find that a very exciting part of this progressive debate that's taking place. I apologise for rushing, and thank you very much for listening.